I am going to give you a general introduction to African writing. When you hear the word Africa, what are the images that come to your mind? I am sure these are all images of violence, images of backwardness, images of cannibalism, images of poverty, images of tribal wars. These are some of the images that come to our mind when we hear the word Africa. And of course, Africa is the dark continent, as our history books have been telling us for ages. Have you ever wondered where these images are coming from? Have you wondered who generated, who produced these images? I am sure that when you think deeply about it, you would realize that these are the images that were manufactured again and again by Western writing about Africa. The West came into contact with Africa in the 15th century, and as probably you know, the slave trade began in the 16th century. So, the Western contact with Africa goes back about 400 years, and in those 400 years, Western writing about Africa has manufactured a number of images, a number of stereotypes about Africa. There are two kinds of stereotypes that exist in the 400 years of British writing, 400 years of Western writing on Africa. These stereotypes can be divided into two different kinds. One, about Africa as a place, and two, African as an individual. Africa as a place has been projected in Western writing as a place of disease, of diarrhea, of AIDS, and generally a dangerous place for the white man. About African as an individual, usually the images that are manufactured, perpetuated in Western writing is African as a noble savage or African as a beastly savage, but savage all the same. This kind of continuing representation of Africa in Western writing forms the background of African writing by African writers themselves. But before I go further, let me remind you that when we use the term African writing or African literature, we must remember that Africa is not a single country. For example, when we talk about American literature, we are talking about literature of one country, America. But when we talk about African literature, we must remember that Africa is not a country, but a continent, and the African continent has something like 55 countries, and there cannot be one single literature for all the 55 countries, and therefore, truly speaking, there is no such thing called African literature. There is only Nigerian literature, Kenyan literature, Ghanaian literature, Ugandan literature, and so on. But for our convenience, we use the term African literature as an umbrella term to cover the literatures of all these 55 countries. Let me also tell you that Africa, or the African writing that we usually read, is the African writing written in English. But English is not the only language in which African writers write. For historical reasons, there are parts of Africa where Portuguese is the major colonial language. So, there is Anglophone African writing, which means writing coming from Africa written in English, but there is also Francophone writing, that is literature written in French. Then there is Lusophone writing, that is literature written in Portuguese. Then there is South African writing, which is, though written in English, is very different from other parts of African writing, other kinds of African writing, because though the language is the same, namely English, the cultural and political history of South Africa has been very different from the culture and history of other African nations which also use English. So, there is, to repeat, there is an Anglophone writing, there is a Francophone writing, there is a Lusophone writing, there is South African writing, and then there is a large area which uses African languages themselves, for example, Kiswahili. African literature written in Kiswahili. So, when we talk about African writing, we must be very clear that we are not talking about a homogeneous unit called African literature, but perhaps what we mean is that African writing in English, African writing written in English. And this is the kind of area, and one of the writers from Anglophone Africa whom you have on your syllabus is Chinua Achebe. Chinua Achebe, as perhaps you know, comes from Nigeria, and he is certainly the most significant African writer writing in English, simply because African writing was put on the world literary map by Chinua Achebe. But before we talk about Chinua Achebe, let me remind you that Chinua Achebe was writing, particularly his early novels were written as an answer to the Western writers writing about Africa. More specifically, his first novel, Chinua Achebe's first novel, Things Fall Apart, was written directly as an answer to two major English texts on Africa. Namely, Things Fall Apart is in a way a reply to Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Joyce Carey's Mr. Johnson. And Chinua Achebe said in an interview that he could ignore lesser writers like Rider Haggard and others, but when a novel like Heart of Darkness was praised as one of the most important, one of the most significant novels of the 20th century, he felt that it was time for him to expose Conrad's racism and the ideology behind Heart of Darkness. So, Chinua Achebe started writing his novels and his essays in response to the Western image of Africa, and he deliberately, he consciously tried to present a completely different picture of Africa written from an insider's point of view. Conrad or Hemingway or Graham Greene, they were all writing about Africa as outsiders. To reverse that picture, Chinua Achebe wrote some of his early novels like Arrow of God, Things Fall Apart, and therefore, Chinua Achebe had a specific reader in his mind when he wrote those novels. And in his essay called The Novelist as a Teacher, he very specifically describes who his reader was. The reader in Achebe's mind was, one, the Western reader who wants to know about Africa, who wants to know the real Africa, and two, he also had in mind the westernized African who felt shameful, who felt guilty about his own past. And Chinua Achebe describes his role as a writer in The Novelist as a Teacher, in this essay called The Novelist as a Teacher. And he feels that the writer has an important role in redefining Africa and to make the African realize what his past was like, what his culture was like, and what his history was like. Because one of the things that Achebe accused Conrad of in The Heart of Darkness was that Conrad denies two important aspects to the African as a person and Africa as a country. These are, Heart of Darkness, according to Achebe, denies Africa a important history. That is, Africa is presented as a place without a history. And in the entire Heart of Darkness, for example, except one single line, no African character is given speech. That is, no African writer was given the freedom to express himself or herself. This is significant because history and language are the two crucial aspects for self-expression and self-representation. So, denying history and denying language became the most contentious issues for Achebe. The beginnings of African novel in English are sometimes traced to the 1930s, when occasionally a novel or two were published in the 1930s. Example, you have two important novels called Chaka, which was written in 1908, was published in 1925, and you have a novel called Moody by Solomon Platche, which was written in 1917, but was published in 1930. These are important events in African writing in English. But properly speaking, the African novel in English began to get its own identity, began to acquire its own independent identity only in the 1950s. But between the 50s and the 30s that I mentioned, the 1940s played an important role in the development of the African consciousness. There are two or three important events in the 1940s which contributed to the growth of the African novel in English. These are two or three issues, two or three movements that I would mention that happened in the 1940s. One, that in the 1940s, there was a cultural movement called the Negritude Movement, where black, the color black, the skin color black was for a long time has been seen in a very denigratory manner, whereas Negritude reversed that sentiment to assert that black is beautiful. So, this was a kind of a self-assertion that took place as part of the Negritude movement. And there are a large number of African writers, poets, novelists, playwrights, etc., who were very heavily influenced by the self-assertion which was brought in by the Negritude movement. And the second important event in the 1940s, which added to the self-confidence of the African writers, was the beginning of a Pan-African movement. And this Pan-African movement had its conferences outside Africa, and the Pan-African Conference meeting in Manchester, held in Manchester in the year 1945, was an important meeting, an important event, because for the first time it was during this meeting of the 1945 Pan-African Conference meeting held at Manchester that independence was for the first time declared as the ultimate goal of the African movements. And the third, apart from Negritude and the Pan-African movement, the third event that I am going to mention is the establishment of the University College of Ibadan in 1948. This University College of Ibadan later became the University of Ibadan. This was an important event because the University College of Ibadan became the meeting point for some of the best and some of the greatest African writers who became major writers later in the 1950s and 60s. For example, Ibadan College was a place where people like writers like Achebe, Ngugi, Serumaga and many others, Okigbo, the Nigerian poet Okigbo, they all studied in the University College of Ibadan. So, the three events in the 1940s which played an important role in the development of African self-confidence, later leading to the growth of African writing are, let me repeat, 1, the Pan-African movement, 2, the Negritude movement, and 3, the establishment of the College of Ibadan in 1948. These three played a very important role in the growth of African writing in English. When we come to the 1950s, towards the end of 1950s, it was already clear that colonial rule was going to end in Africa. The colonial rule, as you know, started after the 1885, the Berlin Conference in 1885, where the major colonial powers divided Africa among themselves. Some parts of Africa were under the English rule, some parts of Africa were under French rule, some parts of Africa were under Belgian rule, and some parts of Africa were under Portuguese rule. This conference, the 1885 Berlin Conference, and the period following that conference was known in history as Scramble for Africa, where all the colonial powers were trying to get a piece of cake, as it were, of Africa. By the end of in the Second World War period, in the 1950s, the colonial rule was coming to an end, and almost abruptly as it started, because the colonial powers now wanted to get out of Africa as quickly as possible. And therefore, the 1950s period, the late 1950s period till the end of 1960s, that entire decade or so was known as the scramble out of Africa, as opposed to the scramble for Africa, which began after the Berlin Conference in 1885. The 1950s and the 1960s is known in history as the scramble out of Africa. And many of these countries, African countries, were ill prepared for independence, because the institutions which should take care of the nation, newly independent nation, the judiciary, the legislature, etc., were not yet ready. The constitutional process was not over, and yet the colonial powers were in a hurry to leave Africa. And as a result, as a direct consequence of this, when the independent countries emerged in Africa, they were ill prepared for self-governance. And as a result, immediately after independence, many of the African countries went through civil wars, political turmoil, instability, fall of governments, and so on. So, this period, that is 1960s, is known as the Decade of Dissolution. The hopes, the aspirations of the people who had lots of hopes in independence, etc., as solving their problems, etc., but of course were not solved immediately, and the political instability in the newly independent nations led to a decade of chaos in Africa in the 1960s. And this instability, this chaos, this lack of direction was reflected in African writing of the 1960s. So, as a consequence of that, the writers were no longer interested in large themes like the issues of race, issues of nation, issues of cultural conflicts, etc. And the disappointed writers were now concentrating more on the individuals and the problems of the individuals in getting accustomed to this new freedom. And therefore, in the 1960s, there is a distinct phase of African writing which reflects this total disillusionment with independence and the breakdown of an organized society into civil wars, into tribal wars, etc. When we talk about the 1960s, where the focus of the writers was on much more narrower issues of individual rather than issues of nation or issues of race, following the 1960s, the 1970s presents a different kind of picture of African writing. After the kind of self-indulgent disillusionment of the 1960s, the writers felt that they also are responsible for giving an alternative vision of African societies. It is not enough to find fault with the newly independent nations, but as writers, they also have a responsibility to provide alternatives. And you see in novels like Aikwe Yarma's Fragments or 2000 Seasons, or in Gugi's novel published in 1977, Petals of Blood, or even Shoinka's novel called Season of Anomie, there is an attempt to provide an alternative framework and an alternative framework which might work rather than merely criticizing, merely finding fault with the post-independent African countries. Of course, the major writers of the 1960s all produced novels which present a very disappointing, a very pessimistic view of the future. For example, you have novels like Arma's The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, or you have Achebe's own novel, The Man of the People, etc. These all present a very depressing picture of African societies. In contrast, the 1970s novels try to give a positive alternative to the disappointment, to the disillusionment of the 1960s. When we come to the more modern period, that is in the last 20 years or so, 2 or 3 major themes emerge in African writing. Some of these themes are: 1, the rise of women writers in African writing; 2, the emergence of the diasporic African writing, that is African writers living not in Africa, but in countries like America or UK. Now, one fine example of this diasporic writing is of course the Booker Prize winner Ben Okri. Ben Okri of course belongs to what one might call the 3rd generation African writing, and he writes not from Africa because he is no longer living in Africa, but he lives in UK, but still continues to write about Africa because that is the reality that he knows. So, the rise of women writers, the rise of diasporic writing, and also the more important feature of the last 20 years or so in African writing is the rise of a kind of writing which no longer feels that they have to be African writers. For example, Ben Okri once said that I am a writer, I am not just a Nigerian writer, or I am not just an African writer, but I am a writer. So, this new picture of a writing, a new picture of an African writer who is not just a citizen of Africa, but who is a citizen of the world. So, this globalization, this internationalization of African writing is one of the features of African writing in the last 20 years. So, to take a once again to summarize what I have been trying to say is that African novel in English, although it began in the 1930s, has 2 or 3 important phases. The first phase is the 1950s, where you had major writers like Chinua Achebe, and you had writers like Chinua Achebe, then a little later Soyinka, etc., who were writing when independence was already in sight. So, their tone in their novels, for example, if you take a novel like Things Fall Apart, there is no blaming of the colonial writers because they were already sure that the colonial masters were already leaving Africa. So, there is a more objective tone, there is a more balanced tone in some of these novels. So, the 1950s novels are the first phase, and you have the 1960s novels which represent the failure of independence in Africa, the disappointment, the disillusionment that was rampant in Africa in the 1960s. So, that is the second phase of African writing, African novel in English. And the third would be 1970s, where instead of merely finding fault, instead of merely withdrawing from the social scene, the African writer was trying to give an alternative possibility, an alternative structure from his point of view. And in the last 20 years, from the 1980s to till now, 2 or 3 major events, 2 or 3 major features that mark African writing are: 1, the globalization of African writing, where the writers are not just writers of Nigeria or Africa, but writers of the world. 2, the emergence of women writers as is a significant feature of the last 20 years or so. And third, the emergence of the African diasporic writer as an important figure in African writing. So, although the history of African novel in English is about 60 years, we can see that there are distinct phases of African writing of the last 50 years or so. What you might have observed is that the African writer has always been responding to the social events, to the changes in the society, and to the social forces. The African writer is an integral part of African society, unlike, for example, the artist in European culture. The artist in European cultures generally sees himself as outside the society, as somebody who is not necessarily part of the society. This is the image of African writer which Achebe contests or which Achebe rejects in the essay The Novelist as a Teacher. For Achebe, the novelist is not outside the society, but is an integral part of the society, and he plays an important role in changing the society and in giving direction to the society as an intellectual. Let me just quote a couple of lines from the essay where this idea is put forth by Achebe very, very powerfully. But before that, let me also remind you that in another essay, Achebe says that art for art's sake is a purely European, is a purely Western concept which is not applicable to African society. He argues that African society always respects the African artist, but the African artist as an integral part of the society and not as a bohemian outsider. Here is the quotation from the essay, The Novelist as a Teacher. Achebe says, "The writer cannot expect to be excused from the task of re-education and regeneration that must be done." So, very clearly Achebe is arguing that the writer has a responsibility, and particularly in a society which is undergoing a traumatic experience, the writer has a responsibility to provide direction and provide education. And he uses the term education in a very broad, with a broad meaning, whereby he feels that the writer has a responsibility to re-educate both the Western reader as well as the Westernized African reader. Here is how he defines his role as a writer in this essay. I quote, "Here then is an adequate revolution for me to espouse, to help my society regain its belief in itself and put away the complexes of the years of denigration and self-denigration." Achebe sees the role of the novelist as a teacher, and as a teacher, he felt that he has a responsibility to re-educate his society, to come out of the centuries of denigration. In the beginning of this, I mentioned how the Western writing about Africa, nearly 400 to 500 years of Western writing about Africa, tried to break the self-confidence of the Africans, self-confidence in themselves and confidence in their own culture. And it is this confidence that Achebe tries to give back to the African in their own culture, in their own history, and Achebe very clearly says that these are his objectives. And Achebe also said that if this is considered to be propaganda, he said, "I have no problem if my novels are called propagandist." So, The Novelist as a Teacher is an essay that should be read as a kind of a statement by Achebe, as a declaration by Achebe, and as a manifesto to understand Achebe's writing. Because this essay, The Novelist as a Teacher, outlines Achebe's views about the responsibility of the writer towards his society.